How do I actually start it?
Should we just come in here?
Well,
Should we just come in here?
well, I think we should just start the webinar because we're
Yeah.
getting late now.
I'll let it and we figure out. Don't mind.
Hi, everyone. Just got people joining now. Just want everyone to join. Like everyone is trickling in, which is great. Thank you so much all for joining. The way this will work is I will go through some slides, as with my colleague Ed here as well. And we'll make sure there's some time to ask questions at the end. This is a mix of some very new polling, which we conducted ahead of this COP, as well as some of our wider work over the past year. So we'll be looking specifically at COP, then some wider issues around climate, nature, the transition, and then a little bit of a deep dive into Green voters as well in particular. So I will start by sharing my screen, if I can get that to work. It's always the eternal challenge. And how do I zoom slideshow? Okay. To start off with, some of you will be very familiar with More in Common's British Seven segments. I'm putting them up here because we'll refer to them throughout this presentation. But these are essentially the seven groups or seven tribes of British public opinion, and they span from progressive activists, who are the most liberal, left-leaning segment, both on social issues and economics, to the incrementalist left, who are a group who share lots of the end goals of progressive activists, but also see a lot more good in the status quo, aren't as politically engaged, I tend to step back from radicalism. Established liberals, who are very similar to what you might think of as sort of Cameronite conservatives or even Blairite Labour supporters. They are quite an optimistic global group, quite liberal, economically lean more to the right. Skeptical scrollers are a group who have been really heavily shaped by the pandemic and their experience of growing up in a sort of digitally first world. They tend to be younger, much more skeptical of the social contract than some other groups. And they're also a group which is more likely to sort of want to find their own truth and look online for information and news sources. Rooted patriots, very similar to what we think of as a sort of typical red wall voter. They are a group who is proud of their community and their country. They tend to feel quite overlooked by elites and want more investment in place in their areas. They're quite a risk-averse segment. They have the highest threat perception of any of the segments. Traditional conservatives, a group who sort of does what it says on the tin. They're a nostalgic group, proud of Britain, but quite skeptical of change. And that particularly affects how they think about issues around climate and environment, but also makes them amongst the strongest advocates of nature. And dissenting disruptors. This is a group who are most unhappy with the status quo, most likely to say when we ask, do you think we should preserve our institutions or burn them all down, that we should just let them all burn. They back strongman leaderships. They're very uncomfortable with multiculturalism and diversity generally. And, if rooted patriots feel overlooked by elites, dissenting disruptors tend to say they feel sort of, I guess, actively disparaged by them. So they are the 7 groups. And this shows you how the segments would vote in an election today. And I just want to draw your attention to a couple of things. So you can see the 3 data points are the 2019 election, the 2024 election, and the 2025 election. You can see progressive activists warns Labour's core. Now the Greens are actually ahead with that segment. The established Liberals, interestingly, the only group where neither the Conservatives nor Labour have really lost support since the election. And then Reform significantly ahead with dissenting disruptors, also with traditional Conservatives. And having not won that red wall group at the general election, now ahead with them. It gives you a sort of sense of how our politics has changed. How does that then relate to climate change and the environment? Progressive activists, as you might imagine, are quite committed to quite ambitious climate action. I think it's fair to say they are out of step with the wider public when it comes to how far and how fast they would go. They're also the only group, for instance, that says just stop oil is a force for good rather than bad. The incrementalist left want Britain to be a leader on climate and support net zero, but also concerned about the fairness of the transition and want to make sure those with the broadest shoulders bear the most of the cost. Established Liberals are interesting because this group sort of loves green technology. They tend to be first adopters. I don't know if any of you read that great Economist piece on net zero dads, but they tend to be in this group. But also they don't want to move too far in a way that sort of damages the economy. Their support for transition is that they think clean green energy is the future, rather than any ideological kind of bent on it. Skeptical scrollers, a more insecure group, mainly focused on reducing bills. They tend to prioritize basically policies that back them, but they're also the most likely to buy into, as I'll go on to talk about, the idea that both fossil fuel companies and renewable companies are changing the evidence to boost their profits. Rooted Patriots are really interesting because this group is really worried about the threat of climate change and, particularly for a socially conservative group, but also their experience as a group is that when it comes to big transitions, and obviously there are slightly older groups, so remember the transitions of deindustrialization of the 70s, 80s, 90s, that communities like theirs tend to be left behind. And their big worry is that both that the costs will be too high, but also they'll be left behind. As I said, the traditional Conservatives, in general, skeptical of government intervention, hesitant to support lots of money being spent on climate, prefer market-based solutions, but, being conservatives, a strong sort of preference and desire to ensure nature is protected. Dissenting disruptors, by far the most skeptical on lots of questions, or not all of them, around net zero, and they need for immediate action. They tend to think it is part of a more political agenda, more likely to believe in climate conspiracies. Again, but they're not denialists. They just question whether the current approach is the right one. So they are the 7 segments on climate. So looking at the big picture, when we asked about a series of threats facing humanity, it was a list of 15 risks. Britain's ranked climate change as the top threat. Every voter group ranks climate change amongst the top 5 threats facing humanity. As you can imagine, it is highest for those who say they would vote Green. But, actually it is top for Labour supporters. It is just in second for Conservative supporters. Reform UK a bit lower, and top for Liberal Democrats there. So the threat is there. But what seems to have happened, or what has very definitely happened, is that the salience of climate has fallen. If we go back to 2022, actually, climate change was up there as a sort of number two, three issue in our tracking. It's now fallen from being a top three issue to around eighth place. The number selecting it has roughly halved as a top issue, and that's in part because climate change is seen to, I guess, have to give way slightly in people's minds to the very pressing issues, and in particular the cost of living. And of course, one of the tensions, perhaps, in public opinion is whether climate change will ultimately help or hinder with reducing the cost of living. And if it falls into the hinder category, it is likely that support will fall. What about COP? Given this webinar is about COP, it's fair to say that the British public do not think much about COP. A fewer than half of the public even know that it's a meeting to discuss climate change. Only 8% say they're very aware of it. And bear in mind, in polls, people like to sound clever, so they overestimate their awareness. So I think we can assume it is pretty low. But the perceived threat of climate change is high for all voter groups. And, in particular, if you look there, a majority of reform voters believe that humanity and the planet are at risk if we don't move to tackle climate change quickly. So international conferences, not high on the agenda, but threat of climate change certainly is. And when people are given sort of information about COP, most people think that previous COPs have had no impact on climate change. 6 in 10 think that the gatherings don't achieve it, and there is even greater skepticism that countries who attend gatherings like COP will stick to the commitments that they have made on climate change. So there is a little bit of kind of, I guess you might call it sort of summit fatigue, and a feeling that, again, when we've done focus groups on this, over successive COPs, the fact that, these end up just being talking shops. And whilst it was certainly the case when we would speak to people when Glasgow had COP, that there was some degree of kind of excitement, that has very definitely given way to a greater degree of cynicism. That said, people do still see climate change as an issue that international governmental organizations have a role to play in. It is just ahead of national governments, actually, when we ask who is best positioned to deal with global climate issues there. And, there is definitely, again, when you speak to people, a sort of, I guess, frustration that there isn't more international cooperation on issues like this. And that comes through very much in the polling. So sorry, this is a slightly confusing set of graphs because there's a lot of data, but for each of them, the top line, the question is our current government doing enough or too little on tackling climate change, or are they doing about the right amount? The second bar is other leaders kind of globally around the world. And as you can see, in general, there is a view that people are more likely to say the UK is not doing enough than doing too much. That the sort of median lands in doing about the right amount there. But when it comes to leaders around the world, a much greater view that they should be doing more. And particularly interesting there is reform voters. So while reform voters tend to think that the UK government is doing too much compared to other groups, a significant percentage, 46%, think that leaders around the world aren't doing enough. And that is, I think, indicative. I think that helps to inform some of the sort of skepticism that you sometimes see from reform voters, not only born out of worries about the cost and pace of transition, but also a sense that other countries aren't doing their bit. I thought this was quite interesting. So we asked about support for net zero and support for the Paris Agreement's target of keeping global warming below 2 degrees. And this shows you the net support, so not overall, it's net support across the different segments I talked about. And as you can see, the more liberal segments, high level of net support for reaching net zero. There is much more hesitancy when it comes to the more socially conservative segments, in particular the dissenting disruptors and traditional conservatives. So while a plurality, 49% support net zero, 20% oppose it, if you focus on the Paris Agreement, 51% support the target compared to just 13% oppose it. And almost every group, apart from the dissenting disruptors, who on net are just below, is supportive of the Paris goal, which, I think feeds into a wider body of evidence that net zero itself seems to have become a sort of polarizing term, even if the goals there. That said, there is quite a deep skepticism that the world will manage to keep to the target of keeping warming below 2 degrees. Interesting that skepticism is even lower for people who oppose the target. And, again, part of their opposition might well be motivated out of the fact that they don't think that this is achievable. And then perhaps this is unsurprising, but I think quite important to look at that when you focus on nature, the nature piece, in this case, a question about deforestation, Britain significantly support plans to stop global deforestation. There is definitely a sort of Attenborough effect in all of this stuff. And those of you who have heard me before in presentations will say, there are 3 things in poll questions which the British public almost always support. They are apprenticeships, banning things, and anything to do with nature or animals. And this very much falls into that category. And there is definitely something around a kind of, if you lead purely on climate, you do not build as big a coalition as people who, for instance, if you look at Reform voters who's discussed are much more sceptical about net zero, 2/3 support action to halt and reverse global deforestation in line with the public average. So where does that leave the UK's role? So, I guess one of the big challenges that we sometimes face in Britain's role in tackling climate change is that Britain is small. Britain is 1% of all emissions. And there is, you can see that quote from Rob is fairly typical of, some of the focus groups we will do where people say, what difference will the UK make? Globally. So overall, people tend to think Britain can make a meaningful difference, around just over half compared to 4 in 10 who think Britain is too small to make an impact. Again, though, there are some clear partisan splits there. Reform voters overwhelmingly think we are too small. Labour and Green Party voters the most likely to think we can make a difference. And I think this is interesting when you look at the extent to which people think countries globally are doing their fair share, bearing in mind that preference for a global response. What we find is that Russia, India, the United States, China, Britain's majorities of Britain say they're not doing enough. Pluralities say the same of Brazil, Nigeria, and South Africa, although there is a much higher chunk of don't knows there. And in the UK, the median Brit is likely to say we're doing about our fair share. Although, as you can see, the proportions are much more evenly split than for any of the countries internationally. And again, that sense of Britain compared to other countries might be going too far too fast is certainly one of the drivers of, if not hostility to net zero, pause for thought, and are we doing the right amount here? Interestingly, though, that when you ask people, when the UK takes actions to reduce our emissions, do you think that it encourages other countries, or does it let other countries off the hook, or does it just make no difference? Actually, not too much of a divide in those that say it lets the countries off the hook. That's fairly consistent across segments. The big difference is the more liberal segments more likely to say it encourages other countries, whereas the more socially conservative segments, rooted patriots, traditional conservative, dissenting disruptors, most likely to say that other countries don't pay attention to the actions of the UK. And I should say that that's a fairly common pattern across our work. That I think socially conservative segments have a frustration that Britain has lost its clout on the world stage. They're more likely to say we get taken advantage of, that we don't prioritize our own interests enough as well. So if that's the UK's leadership role, what about trade-offs? So firstly, I thought this was interesting. We asked when the economic situation in the UK is in a bad state, do you think the government should accelerate, slow down, or keep our plans the same? So again, the median Brit says keep our plans the same. Progressive activists, the only group where you get more than 3 in 10 saying we should accelerate in those circumstances. Traditional conservatives and dissenting disruptors much more likely to say that we should tone down our plans. And certainly, I mean, obviously, this is about the economy writ large. When you ask about personal energy bills, people are much more likely to believe that. That making sure that personal energy bills and the cost of living is as low as it can be should be the priority. And whether that is through the green net zero route or another route, the cost of living crisis is so front of mind to so many Brits at the moment that trumps almost everything. Understandably, trumps everything else. People do think that climate change will have a big effect on lots of issues. So, from heat waves to flooding to food production to the cost of living there. As you can see, there are some issues which people very definitely put in the category. So, they are the heat waves, drought, flooding, food production. Other issues people are a bit more skeptical about. So, whether it's jobs, education, and certainly crime, people are slightly less convinced that it will have a major impact there. But very definitely, the public are, we have noticed from conversations, but also it comes out of polling, are starting to link one element of the cost of living, which is grocery prices. With climate change, particularly, I think it's interesting. The highest there is chocolate, where there have been particular stories in the media about the rising price of chocolate there. And I think this is interesting because, often the British public are assumed to be sort of cakeist when it comes to policy in general, the forthcoming budget being an example of wanting lower taxes and higher public spending. Here, basically, around 4 in 10 equally think we need to make tough decisions and we need to make a trade-off between growth and emissions, versus another group who think that clean technologies will become affordable enough that we can have both high growth and lower emissions. Again, you see that split between the more liberal and more conservative groups. It perhaps isn't surprising that those who are the most optimistic about innovation are the most supportive of net zero as well. Don't know why that flicked back. But there are challenges. So one of those is a growing lack of trust in the transition, and it probably won't surprise you that around half of Brits think it's possible that big oil companies are secretly funding climate denialism to protect their profits. But interestingly, 62% say the same of renewable energy companies, that it's at least possible they're pushing the climate agenda because they stand to make big profits. So on both sides, there is a lack of trust. This isn't just the fossil fuel lobby, and even on issues around around encouraging people to get EVs and the government's role. There's a significant minority who think the government are doing it to boost profits. And I think this is perhaps the bigger one. I mean, I've talked before in these webinars about the fact that only a quarter of Brits think that our climate policies to date have made a meaningful difference to reducing Britain's emissions. And of course, they've fallen by half since the mid 90s. But also, there is just not a sense that Britain's climate policies have made people's communities better off, the country better off yet. And I think, that one near the bottom, that fairness point, I think is sort of particularly important and will determine a lot of future public support one way or the other on climate. Finally, we wanted to do a little section just on, given the rise of the Green Party, and there's been a lot of attention, obviously, on Labour's challenges around migration with its right flank. What is happening on the left? Well, it probably won't surprise you to know that amongst people who have left the Labour Party for the Greens or the Liberal Democrats, climate change is more salient. It's almost twice as salient in the top issue list as it is for the public as a whole. So it is an issue that matters to Labour switchers to the left. And I think this is really interesting, and it needs a little bit of explanation, but it's perhaps the thing which jumped out to me the most when we were putting this data together, which is that there's been a lot of focus on the fact Zach Polanski seems to be more focused on issues around wealth inequality and broader economics than previous Green leaders who were more explicitly focused on the environment. Interestingly, when you look at the Green Party's current voters, so that includes their newer voters, they're actually, and the people who are driving the surge in support for the Green Party, they're actually more green than their previous voters, people who voted for them at the election. So even if the Green Party's message is broader, the people they're attracting are actually more supportive of net zero, more worried that the government isn't doing enough to tackle climate change, more likely to oppose granting of new oil and gas. So it is clearly a big, it remains an important issue, and in fact, sort of counterintuitively, almost more of an important issue. On the flip side, the opposite is happening with reform, which sort of makes sense when you think about it, that Reform's 2024 voters, so people who voted for them last year, are more likely to oppose net zero, more likely to say that the government is doing too much to tackle climate change, more likely to say that the government should be allowing new oil licenses in the North Sea, but their newer supporters, while still clearly more sceptical than the public as a whole, are less so. So they are, more supportive of net zero. They're almost split down the middle on the Paris Agreement and whether the government is doing enough to tackle climate change, for instance. So there is a sort of dual effect happening there with supporters from the different bases slightly changing. The reformers sort of moving more towards where the average Briton is on green issues, whereas Green Party voters actually becoming more pro climate. I've spoken now for half an hour, which is all that I wanted to speak for, or all that I ever should speak for. So I'm just going to stop that there, and I am going to. There is a chat function somewhere where you can put any questions in, and I would be very happy to answer any of them. Or if you need to drop off, I appreciate taking half an hour out of your day already. Is a lot. That is fine. These are recorded, so I can. You can listen back. We will put this presentation on our website as well, along with obviously the full data tables. But if you do have questions, do put it in the Q&A thing. I will leave this for a minute or so. But if not, we can stop. Martin says, apologies, the internet just died. When will it be published? It'll be up on our website later today. Oh, good. Suddenly had loads of questions. Edmund asks, would it be true to say that anti-net zero feeling among some drives significant numbers to reform? I actually don't think that is the case. I think it is a slightly different thing. I think migration and disillusionment drive people to reform. And when you ask reform voters why are they voting reform, migration and a sense all politicians are the same as some, 4 or 5 times more picked by 4 or 5 times more reform voters than climate and environment is, which is usually around 1 in 5, 1 in 6. But they certainly have a greater degree of skepticism, but I just don't think it's a driver in the same way. And, particularly the voters that Reform have won from Labour actually tend to be supportive of net zero. And I think perhaps a challenge for Reform is going to be how far do they go on some of the net zero issues, given their much broader base, and perhaps if you're a reformer, focus on affordability is probably the best way through. Good. That one's done. Elliot asks, have you done much polling on the reaction to the Conservative Climate Change Act announcement? Not specifically on the act, because it's a little bit sort of technical, but we have on sort of general. It is no doubt that the biggest shift in why there has been a bit more of a decoupling of climate from net zero he's a shift amongst Conservative supporters, as you might expect, moving from Boris Johnson, who was broadly much more pro lots of climate stuff, to a leadership that is much more skeptical, pragmatic, pick whichever adjective you want. It's shift, but they are broadly now Conservative voters are split down the middle on net zero, which poses a challenge for the leadership and perhaps explains the sort of fine line that they are treading, which is opposition to CCA and other bits, but not challenging the science or the need to sort of get there eventually. Question from Harry. Why do you think renewables are now perceived as profiteering more than big oil? I suspect it's to do with just that they're in the discourse more. You've got to remember that the public are exceptionally low trust, and the people who are seen to be sort of, pushing something are most likely to be the people who think, they're likely to be on the make, because, the public are used to, lots of examples where where that has happened. I mean, people have certainly not widespread, but certainly in a couple of groups, people have talked about renewables in the same breath as things like PPE and things like that, because the sense of, well, will it actually, will it work? Will it do what it's supposed to do? That piece, I think, is that. There's also a little bit of sort of what I call Grand Old Duke of York syndrome. This, oh, we're going to be told to do this and then it'll turn out it won't work, or we're told to do something else. People still bring up, we were told to do diesel, and in the end, they're told the opposite. So I think that's part of it as well. Katie, do you think that experienced climate change effects more directly will change people's attitudes? Well, look, I mean, it's certainly the case. Again, when we asked about heat waves in the summer, people made the direct link to climate change. I remember summer of 2022, when we had particularly hot weather, people really were making the link then, and salience tends to spike there. And interestingly, particularly with that Rooted Patriot group, they are amongst the most sensitive to climate impacts. So particularly what they see abroad. So, when they see forest fires in Italy or somewhere like that, they tend to react to that as well. So yeah, I think very definitely that is a factor, and obviously then you get into debates around adaptation mitigation, although the public are not having those debates as much. Anonymous attendee says, I do a lot of interfaith work. Are there any insights into how different faith groups feel about climate change? It's a really interesting question. We should do that cut. If you email either me or I'm just Luke at moreincommen.com, or my colleague Louis is on. He's just Louis at moreincommen.com. Afterwards, we'll do a look at the data tables by faith and see if anything jumps out. there. I probably should know more about that, but don't have it to hand. But good question. So, another question from Elliot. As you say, people care deeply about protecting nature, but do they think that climate change is having an impact on nature or their local environment? Yes, they tend to, and people notice. Again, when we did, I think it's up on the website, when we did our summer seminar for Climate Action Week, one of the points I made is that, and it goes back to the previous question about climate impacts, is tangibility really matters to people. And so one of the areas that people will bring up climate change or the impact of climate change is, oh, those flowers have come out earlier than they normally would, or, oh, everything, all the flowers came out, and then there was a frost or something. So people very definitely notice that and are worried about it, and it is one of the biggest drivers of action. And actually, if you look at the conservative group in particular, messages around preserving nature can flip some in that group into being more supportive. The issue the other way is if climate is seen to come into tension, sorry, climate action is seen to come into tension with nature, for instance, some of the decisions that might be required around electrification, that could be a challenge the other way as well. I have a question from Charlie Cooper. How big a turn-off is net zero skepticism for voters? It sounds like voters aren't switching to reform because of net zero skepticism. Yes, but is there evidence of voters actively rejecting reform, rejecting Tories because those parties turned against net zero? So it's a little bit. It's hard to. I don't think yet there is particular evidence of that. What there was certainly is anything where you can, where the British public are likely to buy the more skeptical argument is around costs, bills, affordability. Anything that looks, and we've tested this before, like it is punishing net zero for the sake of punishing net zero is very definitely unpopular or a turn off. So just saying no to wind turbines for the sake of it, wind turbines actually far less polarizing than people think they are, or anything which goes the other way. There were, I think it was the reform proposals to tax renewables more. Actually, when we pulled that was a disaster because people thought it would put up energy bills. So there's a sort of degree of, I think most of the public are in, well, certainly we know the vast majority of the public, as we've said, are clearly worried about climate change, think it's a big threat. They want us to see us get there. And if you're seen to be getting in the way of us getting there, that I think has an electoral penalty. What doesn't have an electoral penalty is we can't bankrupt the country in sort of doing it, if that makes sense. But out and out climate skepticism has an electoral penalty. As I say, net zero itself has very definitely become more polarizing. Question from Nathan: what are public attitudes towards Labour's climate policy more broadly, and has that driven support to the Greens? Well, look, it certainly is very much the case that switchers think that Labour needs to be going faster, and that the government needs to be doing more on climate change. And I think when we do, sort of talk to progressives and people, what I sometimes call, Labour defectors, for want of a better word, to the left, one of the things that they put in that I'm frustrated about the pace of change, along with NHS, public services, cost of living, is they're not doing as much on climate. So I think it is very much an open sore on Labour's left flank, and thinking ahead to the budget and other things, talking about climate as part of a broader values proposition and who is bearing the burdens might be one of the ways of shoring that up. Anonymous, have you done any polling asking focus groups on the intergenerational points? How much are we doing this for benefits today versus benefits of grandchildren? I'm sure we must have asked about that. I can't think of a specific question, but I will have a look. What is certainly the case is that in focus groups, people bring up, I'm worried about my kids and my grandkids. and their future. It won't affect me, but so I think that is particularly a driver for some people in older generations. Some people obviously go the other way and say, "Well, yeah, I'm not going to be around. It's not going to affect me," but most people don't. And then Katie. We're often told we should keep our messaging very positive, but I sometimes feel there isn't awareness of how bad things are looking, especially from skeptics. What do you think on how people respond to positive versus negative? Oh, yeah, an interesting question. I mean, I sort of um, it's kind of a bit of both, really. People want, what is motivating a rooted patriot to take action against climate change is they are worried, right? And that negative message is there. I just think that the negative message has to come alongside, and this is doable, and we can do it because the problem is otherwise, if you're a climate advocate, you get into fatalism, which is you know, it's similar in naturally work we do around international aid, which when you look at public attitudes, there's a lot of people saying, well, we're still seeing the same message as we were 30 years ago. It's clearly made no difference at all. So I think it's that. I think it's stressing the urgency with the doability. And Louisa has a question. Do you have any insights from focus groups on what people would see COP30 as being a success? What would have to start happen for people to start believing in the process again? I don't have any sort of specifics on what people want to see. I guess it's sort of it's having a global meeting and then people seeing action as a result. I think is more it, and I think it's probably better to look at what has driven the skepticism about these big global gatherings, and it is a sense of they get together, they talk a lot, and then nothing happens. So I think sort of people seeing tangible things, whether it's a sort of update. This is this is how far we've gone to implementing things we agreed, and that piece as well. But for most people, they're not thinking about the big international stage that much. But I think I think particularly in Britain, because there was so much fanfare around Glasgow COP, I think that has led to some sort of feelings of, oh, we did all that and then nothing happened. But that obviously ties into the wider public mood that not a lot is going right at the moment, which wasn't a particularly cheery mood to lead the last question on, but that was the last question. But then, there are clearly, the public are pragmatic. This is an issue they're worried about, but I think the big message is how do you convince, if you are a climate advocate, how do you convince people you're doing it in the right way, which is taking sort of bringing people with you, linking it to bills. And if you're someone who is more skeptical about net zero, I guess to Charlie's point, how do you not look like you're running in the face of what seems inevitable to lots of people, or the right thing to do, even if there is pacing on it? Good. That seems to have exhausted our questions. Thank you so much for so many of you joining on a busy, certainly where I am, rainy London, although we weren't outside, so the rain probably doesn't affect whether you decided to join or not, but a busy Monday. And as I say, we'll get those slides up. Please do feel free to reach out to any of us as ever if there's any more of interest from our work on this or other issues. Thanks so much.